Hello everyone, welcome back to class. Today we are continuing on in our third module, looking at the other two principles of biomedical ethics that underlie medical practice today. Last time we looked at autonomy and non-maleficence. Recall that within clinical settings we try to respect the autonomy of patients, the care team, and other people. This means respecting largely their desires and their wishes, the decisions that patients want to make about their treatment, provided that they are competent, that they have decisional capacity. There are some times where we might want to override that, but that depends on whether or not they are capable of engaging in certain thought processes and decisions. We also talked about non-maleficence, which has to do with basically refraining from doing harm. We want to make sure that we are not causing anybody any unnecessary pain or suffering or causing harm through our actions or our inactions. Today we're going to talk about the other two principles, beneficence and justice, and we'll go through them in turn. The second half of this chapter is very comprehensive, so I have a lot of information that I want to get out on the table. If you feel like I'm throwing a lot at you, I'm sorry. Just try to take the key ideas and listen to this lecture a few times if you have to. We can basically define beneficence as duty to help others further their important and legitimate interests. So, in biomedical ethics and practice, it's generally accepted that we have some sort of duty to do good to people, to further their interests, to look out for their well-being. Another way of putting this is that healthcare providers, if they're going to be beneficent, ought to prevent evil or harm, remove evil or harm from someone, and do or promote good. In practice, this means that healthcare providers should protect and defend the rights of others, prevent harm from occurring to others, remove conditions that will cause harm, help persons with disabilities, and rescue persons in danger. And the way that we will carry these out is obviously going to depend on the context, the setting, the institution that we are in. Because not all these different arenas have the same rules, are guided by the same moral or legal laws. And so what it means to be beneficent may differ depending, for example, if you're working in a Catholic hospital or a secular hospital. In any case, what we just need to internalize is that just as we have a duty to refrain from harming people, we also have a duty to help people in some general sense. In contrast to non-maleficence, which says that we have some sort of duty to not act or refrain from acting, beneficence compels us to act. It says that we have some sort of duty or obligation to do some actions. Thus, in contrast to non-maleficence, which compels non-action or inaction, beneficence compels action. Another way of putting this is that non-maleficence says, don't do this stuff, some certain stuff, and beneficence says, you gotta do this other stuff. In their landmark work, Principles of Biomedical Ethics, Beauchamp and Childress distinguish between two different types of beneficence. There is specific beneficence and general beneficence. Specific beneficence says that we have certain positive obligations to those that we are in special relationship with, like our children, our siblings, our parents, or in healthcare settings, our patients. So the idea is that generally we should promote people's interests and well-being, but we ought to perform certain actions for those that we are in special relationship with. For example, I do not have a moral obligation, let's say, to care for somebody else's children like that person's parents do. Similarly, I don't have the same moral obligation to look out for a stranger like you do for your brother or your sister. And within clinical settings, obviously, care teams, healthcare providers have some sort of duty or priority to help those that are within the hospital, are within the institution, and then secondarily helping those outside of the institution. Thus, specific beneficence argues we have certain obligations to those that we are in relationship with, that we are close to. But we also have certain obligations to all people, even if we're not in special relationships with them. Different kinds of obligations. This is what is known as general beneficence. We have certain duties or obligations to all people. Strangers, neighbors, acquaintances. They might not rise to the same level of duty and obligation that we have to people close to us, but we do have some sort of obligation to help them in certain situations and look out for their good. Beauchamp and Childress argue, however, that we as humans do have certain duties to these people that are strangers or acquaintances to us, but that those duties are informed by certain conditions. Certain conditions have to be met in order for these duties to be impressed upon us. Let me go over those now. First, we have some sort of duty to help out a stranger or an acquaintance, someone that we're not in close relationship with, if the person is at risk of serious loss or damage to life or one of their other major interests. So, if someone is facing down a particularly bad event or situation, and it would do them a lot of harm, or it would really set them back, we have kind of a duty to help them. Of course, there are certain caveats that go along with this. Another caveat is that we have a duty to help them if our action is needed to prevent this loss or damage to the person, if our action has a high probability of preventing this loss or damage, and our action would not place significant cost, risk, or burden on us. So, if you see somebody, for example, that is hanging off the edge of a cliff and they're about to die, and you can easily reach down and pull them up, and it doesn't endanger your life, and your action has a high probability to save them, then we have some sort of moral obligation to do that thing. The idea basically being, look, if we can help people out significantly, and that is not going to cost us a lot, it's going to benefit them a lot, and it doesn't place a huge burden on us, then there are certain actions that we ought to perform. Finally, the last condition that they introduce is that through acting, the person is likely to receive benefits which outweigh any harm, cost, risk, or burden that we produce through our action. The basic idea is this. We have certain obligations to those that we are in special relationship with, and we have certain obligations to other people, even if they are strangers, even if they are just acquaintances, but that these duties, we act on them in light of certain conditions. In this chapter, case 2D goes through a particular, more specific case of beneficence that might appear within a clinical setting. So I'm going to go over that to see if any of the actors in this situation do or do not meet this principle. Case 2D. A 79-year-old female patient, let's call her Mrs. Y, was admitted to the hospital with an acute non-Q wave myocardial infarction. On cardiac catheterization, she was found to have a tapering stenosis of the left anterior descending coronary artery, LAD, a 60% obstruction proximally increasing to a 90% obstruction distally. If I don't pronounce all these words right, please forgive me. The right and circumflex systems were found to be diffusely but mildly diseased. Her ejection fraction was about 40%. The patient was evaluated at a medical surgical conference, and because of the nature of the LAD lesion, which rendered percutaneous transluminal coronary angioplasty difficult, coronary artery bypass grafting was considered. Ultimately, however, the recommendation was for medical therapy. 2 days after being discharged from the hospital on medical therapy, the patient was brought to the hospital in cardiac arrest and pulmonary edema. She was resuscitated and found to have suffered no permanent neurologic sequelae, and she was stabilized through the use of an intra-aortic balloon pump, IABP. Myocardial infarction was ruled out. Over the following days, numerous efforts to remove the balloon pump were unsuccessful. The patient's coronary artery perfusion was dependent on the IABP. Her physicians believed that her only chance for survival was revascularization. Because the facility at which she was hospitalized did not offer cardiac surgery or angioplasty, her physicians contacted cardiothoracic surgeons at a number of regional facilities. All of them refused to accept the patient in transfer because her surgical mortality was felt to be unacceptably high, and it was believed that her likely death would adversely affect their mortality statistics, which were being published in the state in which they practiced. By day 9 of hospitalization, her condition had deteriorated further, and believing at this point that it was riskier for the patient to undergo CABG than PTCA, her physicians contacted interventional cardiologists at a number of regional facilities. All refused to accept the patient because she was so high risk. On day 21 of hospitalization, she died. Was the refusal of the subspecialists to accept Mrs. Y in transfer a violation of the principle of beneficence? Well, here's the analysis they provide. The issue is whether the subspecialists violated the principle of beneficence. Recall from the previous discussion that there are two categories, specific and general. Specific beneficence is the obligatory beneficence that we owe to those others with whom we are in a special relationship. Were any of the subspecialists who were asked to accept Mrs. Y in transfer in a special relationship with her? Probably not. There's no indication in the facts provided that any of them were in a pre-existing doctor-patient relationship with her. What about the fact that they were asked by the physicians caring for her to accept her in transfer? Does that create a special relationship? Because traditionally, physicians have been free to determine which patients they will and will not see, the answer is probably no. A special relationship might exist if, for example, there was a law in place prohibiting subspecialists from refusing transfers, such as this one. Alternatively, a special relationship might be found to exist if the referring physicians and the subspecialists were all on the medical staff at the institution where the patient was hospitalized, and there was in place a call schedule for subspecialists. Therefore, the subspecialists are arguably owe no duty of specific beneficence to Mrs. Y. Do they owe an obligatory duty of general beneficence to Mrs. Y? Recall that a person X owes an obligatory duty of beneficence toward a person Y if Y is at risk of significant loss of or damage to life or health or some other major interest. The person's action is needed to prevent this loss or damage. The person's action has a high probability of preventing this loss or damage. The person's action would not present significant risks, costs, or burdens to themselves, and that the benefit that the person Y can be expected to gain outweighs any harms, costs, or burdens that the person is likely to occur by their action. Because strong arguments can be made that each of these conditions apply to the case under discussion, we believe a very strong argument can be made that the subspecialist's refusal constituted a violation of the principle of beneficence, specifically of an obligatory, as opposed to ideal, duty of general beneficence. So, the authors conclude that due to the nature of this situation, the subspecialists actually did violate the principle of beneficence. Presumably, they argue that some sort of action should have been taken by some other facility in the region to try to save Mrs. Y's life, even though there might have been a chance of her dying in the transfer. Because we can conclude that, like it happened, if she received no treatment, she was going to die in the hospital. So case 2D provides a study in what may or may not violate this principle of beneficence. Another consideration that we need to bring into the picture is what's known as paternalism. Paternalism is defined in this chapter as the intentional overriding of one person's known preferences by another person, where the person who overrides justifies the action by the goal of benefiting or avoiding harm to the person whose preferences are overridden. In other words, paternalism basically involves exercising some sort of control over someone's life. Think of the word parent when you think of paternalism. What does a parent do? Well, for a child, a parent basically protects them from harm and constrains their free will in order to look out for their good. Since we have a duty to do good to others, cases may come up when we have some sort of duty to do good, but that may violate the autonomy of the patient in question. That's what we're concerned with now. Considerations of beneficence intersect with this issue. When, where, how do we violate patient autonomy? Well, Beauchamp and Childress try to make the discussion a little clearer and provide some answers by giving us a helpful distinction between soft and hard paternalism. Soft paternalism involves overriding a patient's actions, wishes, concerns, etc. to prevent non-autonomous conduct. So the idea is something like, if we are going to carry out our duties to be beneficent, and one of our patients, for example, isn't decisional, isn't competent, soft paternalism involves overriding their wishes, concerns, or decision because they're not in the right mind to actually make a rational decision here. We can contrast this with hard paternalism, which involves overriding a patient's actions, wishes, concerns, even if they are autonomous. Soft paternalism usually isn't really argued against. In a lot of different healthcare situations and settings, it's generally acceptable to override a patient's concerns if they are not decisional. Because the people, the care team looking out for them, knows and is capable of doing what's best for them, and they're not able to do that for themselves. But a lot of questions come up when we talk about hard paternalism. When, if at all, is it ever justifiable to override somebody's autonomous decision to either deny treatment or do something else? Well, the authors of this chapter argue that hard paternalism is only justifiable if certain conditions are satisfied. 1, the patient is at risk of a serious, preventable harm. 2, the paternalistic action will probably prevent the harm. 3, the projected benefits to the patient outweigh risks to the patient. And 4, the action least restrictive to autonomy is taken. So, the general idea is that in some cases it might be justifiable to override somebody's autonomous decision if the patient is at risk of a serious preventable harm. We can prevent that. The benefits outweigh the risks, and the path of least restriction is taken. Of course, cases are going to be different, right? In the US, for example, a lot of cases that we might think justify hard paternalism don't seem to actually do that, according to a bunch of different ethical concerns and considerations. Based on what I've seen and heard, it seems like a lot of institutions seem to err on the side of respecting patient autonomy rather than overriding autonomous decision making. But of course that is going to vary depending on the institution that you're a part of, the particular patient and case in question. Thus, to summarize, another principle of biomedical ethics is that we have a duty to do good to people. This means looking out for them, promoting their interests, furthering their well-being. Sometimes this justifies overriding their decisions if they are not competent, for example. Sometimes it involves overriding their decisions if they are competent. But those cases are going to be much harder to justify. Let's now move on to the last principle that I'd like to talk about. This principle is justice. And the authors explain that basically this principle is defined as fair distribution of social benefits and burdens. A lot of questions in healthcare settings come up with regards to, well, who is benefiting from what's happening and who is bearing the burden of what's happening. Last time we talked about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It was argued, and I think most of us, if not all of us, would agree, that the way that experiment conducted was not just. Its burdens fell disproportionately on the black men in that study, and it's not clear that the social benefits were equally distributed among social groups in society. Thus, we're concerned with justice not only in the field of medical research, but also in what happens in hospital settings and other clinical settings where care is being provided. The authors of this chapter note that this principle of justice, fair distribution of social benefits and burdens, is influenced by something that Aristotle once argued in his works, which is known as the principle of formal justice. The principle of formal justice says, equals should be treated equally and unequals be treated unequally in proportion to their relevant inequalities. The basic idea being, look, we don't all operate, we don't all have the same place in society. Our roles are different, our capacities are different, our situations are different. What is going to be just, what just treatment looks like, involves considering all of this stuff. Our positionality, history, how goods and resources have been distributed, etc. So, in trying to make this a little bit clearer, what justice actually looks like, a lot of different standards of distributive justice have been offered to determine which inequalities between people are relevant, so we can decide, how to treat certain social groups, and when differing treatment should be engaged in. Whether or not some group should get more of this, some group should get more of that, whether or not the social benefits and burdens of practice are distributed equally. I'm going to go over a few of these different standards of distributive justice now. And I'm going to give you some, hopefully, helpful names to attach to them. These are names that I've come up with for these standards, just thinking through them on my own. So you may not find these within the literature. These are just helpful terms that I'm going to give y'all if you want to talk about this stuff in the discussion posts. There's this idea that what justice means is giving to each person an equal share of something. That is, everybody gets the same amount of food and water, everybody gets the same amount of doctor's visits or whatever it is. We can call this material equity. Equalizing what is given to people from the big socioeconomic pie. Everybody gets an equal share. This, of course, is not the only standard that's offered. There's also one that argues justice involves giving to each person according to their need. So, if I have a greater need for antibiotics than you do, then if we're going to be just, I should be given the antibiotics before you are. Or if I'm dying from malnutrition and thirst, what's just is that the resources be allocated to me before they're allocated to you, somebody who is not starving or not parched. We could call this distribution of necessity. The big pie should be distributed based on who needs what and how much they need first. Another standard says that to be just, we should distribute to each person according to the effort that they put in society. We could call this distribution of endeavor. The way that this standard works is it argues, well, what it means to treat people justly is they bear the social benefits and burdens proportionate to how much effort they're putting in to keep this whole thing running. We can contrast this standard with something a little different, which argues that fair distribution involves giving to each person according to their contribution to society. Let's call this distribution of product. That is, maybe what's just isn't giving people to each according to their effort, but giving to each according to, well, what are they actually bringing to the table? How much are they actually helping things? What actually are they affecting and accomplishing? What is their contribution? Finally, we can contrast these with two other standards. The standard I'm calling distributive meritocracy says that what is just is fair distribution of social benefits and burdens to each person according to their merit. So, what do they deserve as a result of, well, perhaps the kind of people that they are, the kind of ideas and values that they have, what they've accomplished, how hard they've worked, and perhaps how far they have come. So maybe we could say that this merit standard of justice kind of involves effort and contribution and obstacles. How many obstacles the person has faced. Finally, we can look at one other standard that's offered. This is what I call laissez-faire distribution. Basically, this standard of justice says that we should give to each person according to free market exchanges. Basically, we should kind of take a hands-off approach to how things are distributed and let market forces handle things. This is kind of the distribution of justice that is often associated with capitalism, because historically capitalism has been associated with the free market, letting market forces, supply and demand, decide who gets what and how much they get. If we're going to look at things through this kind of economic analysis, we could say that the first two standards of justice, to each person an equal share and according to their need, might be more communistic in essence. These are some of the different standards of distributive justice that have been offered to determine, well, what inequalities matter, how do we resolve those, on what basis should we distribute the benefits and the burdens of all of these things, practices, processes that are going on in society. To be a little bit more general, we could talk about competing theories of justice, different views on not only how we should distribute things, but what it means to call a thing just, what it means to call a behavior, an idea, a practice just. Philosophers and other thinkers throughout the centuries have offered differing views on what makes a thing just or unjust, and what kind of social and economic structures are just, as well as policies. So I'm going to go through a few of those, because they also inform how medical practice is done and how healthcare institutions are structured today. First, we could talk about the utilitarian theory of justice. This view says we should pursue that distribution of justice which maximizes happiness in the universe. It promotes the greatest utility or good. This theory is rather self-explanatory. It says, look, if we're trying to figure out how to distribute benefits and burdens in society, we should try to establish that distribution that is going to maximize happiness in the universe, that is going to make the most amount of people the best off that we can make them. Just like the utilitarian ethical theory that we looked at, this view takes kind of a quantitative view of justice and what it means to organize society. Thus, we could say that this theory of justice is kind of consequentialist. What it means to have a just society, in other words, is one in which things are distributed in a way that makes everybody as best off as we can make them. Certain rules and principles be damned. On this view, just like utilitarianism, generally the ends justify the means. Individual rights should not be prioritized over everything else. Rather, we should prioritize, basically like communitarianism says, the public good. Are we maximizing utility or good in the universe or not? We can contrast this theory of justice with the one that is offered by John Rawls, a very important and influential political theorist in the 20th century. We can call this view Rawlsian egalitarianism. And it is like it sounds. It basically promotes equality. In other words, we could define it as follows. Rawlsian egalitarianism is the view that we should pursue that distribution of justice which equalizes opportunity, goods, and resources across everybody in society, unless certain inequalities are to everyone's advantage. So the basic idea is, look, we're not necessarily concerned with maximizing happiness, because that might involve, giving some people a lot, giving some people a little. On Rawls's view, there's this idea that we should kind of respect individual liberties, but our priority should be to try to equalize opportunity, goods, and resources so that everybody is equal under the law, nobody has an unfair advantage or disadvantage. Generally, people have access to the same goods and resources. Basically, just think of this view as trying to make everything equal for people. Unless, of course, inequality does actually advantage society more. But those are going to be rare circumstances. Rawls formulated this. He encourages us to think about this ethical view in light of what thought experiment he calls the veil of ignorance. In his book, he asks the reader to consider, if you were somebody who could construct the kind of laws and society in which you were going to live, imagine that you didn't know anything about yourself. You didn't know what your race was, your gender, your age, your sex. Imagine that you were trying to construct society from behind a veil of ignorance. What kind of society would you end up constructing? Well, he says, if you're rational, what you're going to try to do is, because you don't know anything about yourself, you're not going to give any unfair advantages to people of a certain race or sex or gender, because you don't know which group you're going to fall into. Thus, Rawls uses this veil of ignorance thought experiment to help justify some of the egalitarian political philosophy that he puts forth in that book. And the authors also mentioned this thought experiment a little bit, but I thought I would explain it to y'all since I'm assuming you have not taken many philosophy classes before. Finally, let's talk about one other theory of justice that's mentioned. We're going to call this Nozickian libertarianism, because it's based on the political philosophy of Nozick, which he writes about in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. In this book, Nozick puts forth a following view of justice. We should pursue that distribution of justice which occurs through the, quote, unfettered operation of fair procedures, unquote. In other words, the kind of distribution of justice that we should pursue is one that takes justice as being dependent on how a distribution comes about, not how much stuff people have. In other words, we should try to make the rules of the game fair, of the economy and of society, and then basically see how things shake out. We shouldn't necessarily try to make everybody have the equal amount of stuff. What it means to have a just society is one in which there is a fair or just operation that decides the distribution of goods. Nozick argues that this theory of justice is in line with three considerations: that things are appropriated in a fair way, that things are transferred in a fair way between people, and that past, let's say, disadvantages, injustices are ameliorated to the proper degree. In other words, a just society is going to be one which defends the ability or right, let's say, of people to appropriate things that are previously unheld, to transfer them in a free way, and which seeks, in some sense, to ameliorate for past injustice. This theory is much more libertarian than the other ones. The utilitarian theory of justice is going to say, well, we just got to maximize happiness. That doesn't necessarily lead to equality. Rawls is going to say, we should basically distribute opportunity, goods, and resources equally. And Nozick is going to say, we shouldn't care so much about what the distribution ends up as long as how the distribution came about occurred in a fair and just way. All of these theories of justice inform healthcare practice today in their own unique ways. And though they're not often explicated, I think if you dig deep, you will find elements of them within some policies that your hospital or your clinical setting adheres to. At the end of this chapter, the authors talk about two more large things. One, what do we do when resources are scarce in care settings? And two, are there any weaknesses with doing biomedical ethics according to principles like this? We'll take them each in turn, and then we'll end the lecture. In medicine, the authors argue that healthcare systems should respond to people based on their actual need, and this is how we tend to do things nowadays. But scarcity of resources becomes a concern. We live on a planet with finite resources. To get more specific, there is only so much goods to go around. There are only so many healthcare providers that can help out people. There are only so many organs that can be donated and surgically implanted into people. So in light of that, in light of the fact that there's scarcity of resources, how do we organize our healthcare systems, our hospitals, and our other clinical settings? Well, thinkers have argued for various systems. One, based on chronology, basically first come, first served system. A chronological system distributes healthcare based on, well, who arrives first. We could also organize our hospitals and other clinical settings around lottery. That is, it's random chance who's going to be seen first, who's going to be able to talk to a doctor and address their ethical concerns. A lot of clinical settings utilize a waiting list system. This is similar to chronology, but it also involves taking into account people's specific medical concerns and considerations. So, if I have a broken bone, for example, and I arrive at the emergency room to get it fixed, and somebody 15 seconds later rushes in and is having a heart attack, generally, if the waiting list system is being implemented, the person who's having the life-threatening concern, the heart attack, is going to be seen before me. And people think that this is a fair way to organize things. Finally, some settings also organize things based on what the authors call criteria, which is basically an amalgamation of the chronology and waiting list systems with other considerations listed. What is the person's medical history like? Has this person been into this hospital before with the same problems? What are causing these problems? A bunch of different considerations come into play in this kind of system. Thus, in order to resolve some of these conflicts that come up due to scarcity of resources, healthcare systems organize themselves in different ways in order to treat people. Which systems we employ, or should employ, are also going to be based on the ethical theory that we tend to follow. So all of the things that we've been looking at in this class, ethical theories, principles, theories of justice, they're all going to impact basically healthcare policy and how healthcare institutions are run and why. So we've looked at the 4 different principles of biomedical ethics: autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. Today, medical practice is informed by adherence to these principles. But you might be asking yourself, are there cons to structuring our practice and our ideas according to these principles? Well, there are, and they're considered by the authors at the end of this chapter. For one, the principles don't really provide specific guidelines for action. The principles tell us generally the kinds of duties that we have, but they don't tell us what to do in any specific given situation. That's something that we're going to have to decide based on the context, based on previous cases, based on what ethical theory we think is the right one, based on need as well. So really the principles only provide a general sketch for how we should act. They don't provide specific guidelines for all particular cases. That's what makes administering care so difficult. Cases are unique and they're complex and they have a lot of different moving parts. Insofar as we want to adhere to these principles, we got to do a lot of thinking and a lot of conversing in order to meet them. Second, the principles don't distinguish between what is required of us and what is encouraged. And this kind of gets back to the first point. I think all people recognize that we have certain obligations to others, certain actions that we ought to perform, but the principles that we've been looking at are not super specific as to what we absolutely need to do as healthcare providers and what would be good to do, but what is not necessary in order to be a moral person. So again, there's lack of specificity here, lack of specific guidelines. Finally, the last big problem that the authors bring up is that the principles themselves don't provide guidelines for resolving conflicts between our duties, our concerns, our goals, etc. Oftentimes, our duties are going to conflict. We have a duty to respect the autonomy of our patients, but we also have the duty to look out for their well-being, to be beneficent. The principles themselves can't tell us when one of those should take priority, whether or not we should override a patient's autonomy or not, whether or not we should override beneficence in terms of systemic justice, ameliorating systemic injustice. In real life cases, our duties, our goals, our treatment options are going to conflict. And so the principles themselves are not going to tell us how to resolve those. Again, that's something that we're going to have to figure out through a lot of reflection, conversation, and rational thought. Okay, well that basically wraps up Module 3. In the first 2 modules, we looked at different ethical theories that medical practice is based on. And in this one, we looked at the different principles that underlie biomedical ethics. I hope this has been informing and enlightening. I'm curious to see what y'all are going to say in your discussion post. Thank you for all for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.